I was looking through a stack of parish records from a forgotten corner of East London last winter, the kind of documents that haven't been touched since the smog of the 1880s stained their edges. Most of it was the usual tally of the Victorian poor: births, marriages, and the relentless rhythmic entries of deaths. But there was one note scribbled in the margin of an 1862 burial register that stopped me cold. It didn't list a cause of death like consumption or scarlet fever. It simply said, "Taken back by the Gentry." In the mid-19th century, the Gentry wasn't a reference to the upper class. It was a euphemism for the fairies. We like to think of the Victorian era as the peak of rationalism, the age of the steam engine, the telegraph, and the cold, hard logic of the Industrial Revolution. We imagine a world of top hats and factory whistles where the old superstitions of the countryside had been crushed under the weight of progress. But the more I sit with these archives, the more I realize that the city didn't kill the old myths. It just gave them a much darker purpose. I remember standing on a street corner in Whitechapel, trying to reconcile the modern glass buildings with the descriptions I'd read in the diaries of city missionaries. Back then, the air was a thick yellow soup of coal smoke and horse manure. The tenements were so crowded that families didn't live in rooms, they lived in corners. And in those shadows, a very specific, very ancient fear began to resurface. It was the myth of the changeling. Most people know the basic story from childhood tales, the idea that a fairy would sneak into a house through the chimney or a window, steal a healthy human infant, and leave a withered, demanding, unearthly creature in its place. In the Irish and Scottish countryside, this was a way to explain the unexplainable. But in the heart of London, the changeling myth became something else. It became a survival strategy. It was a psychological loophole that allowed a mother to look at a child she could no longer afford to feed and see something other than her own flesh and blood. I found a letter from a young woman named Martha, written to her sister in 1874. She described her third child, a boy who had been born strong and bright, but had suddenly turned at 8 months old. She wrote about how he had become wizened, how his limbs had thinned to sticks, and how he did nothing but wail with a hunger that could never be satisfied. She didn't use the word malnutrition. She didn't talk about the fact that she was working 16 hours a day in a match factory and had nothing but watered-down bread to give him. Instead, she whispered a different truth. She said the boy was heavy as lead and had a look in his eyes that was too old for a babe. She was convinced the real boy had been stolen, and the thing in the cradle was an interloper. It's easy for us to look back with a sense of modern superiority and call this ignorance, but I've spent enough time studying the failure to thrive cases of that era to see the mercy hidden in the madness. When a child is starving, when their bones are softening from rickets, and their skin is turning a sickly, translucent grey, the reality is too painful to bear. If that child is your son, his suffering is your failure. But if that child is a changeling, a supernatural entity that has usurped your son's place, then his suffering isn't your fault. In fact, the folklore told Martha that the only way to get her real son back was to treat the changeling with such neglect or even cruelty that the fairies would be forced to return the original child. I sat in the British Library for hours, tracing the intersection of these fairy beliefs with the surge in infanticide and child abandonment during the mid-Victorian period. There was a direct, chilling correlation. In the 1860s, the foundling problem had reached a breaking point. Thousands of infants were being left on doorsteps, in church pews, or simply in the mud of the Thames. And when these mothers were caught, when they were brought before a magistrate, their defense often veered into the uncanny. They didn't always say they were poor. They said the child had changed. They said it wasn't theirs anymore. There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when you realize that a whole culture was using a fairy tale to mask a mass tragedy. I started wondering about the signs they looked for. The folklore was very specific. A changeling was identified by its unnatural appetite, its shriveled appearance, and its ill-tempered nature. To a modern doctor, these are the textbook symptoms of extreme iron deficiency and caloric deprivation. To a Victorian parent in a cellar flat, these were the marks of the hidden people. I remember finding a police report from 1868 regarding a strange occurrence in a tenement near the docks. A father had been found attempting to prove his daughter was a changeling by holding her over a low fire. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man who had watched 4 other children die of the summer flux and couldn't handle the sight of a fifth one fading away. He truly believed that if he tested the creature with iron or flame, it would vanish up the chimney, and his healthy, laughing girl would be sitting on the hearth. It was a desperate, horrific act of faith, fueled by a total lack of options. This wasn't just happening in the slums either. The fear of the altered child permeated through the middle classes, though they gave it more scientific-sounding names. But the root was the same. The Victorian obsession with purity and health meant that any child born with a disability, or any child who regressed due to illness, was seen as a fundamental break in the natural order. They were othered almost immediately. I've often thought about the sheer weight of that collective delusion. Imagine the atmosphere of a London night, the gaslights flickering, the fog dampening the sound of the hansom cabs, and inside a cramped room, a family is watching a cradle. They aren't looking for a smile or a first word. They are looking for a slip-up. They are waiting for the baby to speak in a voice too deep for its lungs or to show a strength it shouldn't have. They are looking for a reason to stop loving it, because loving it is a death sentence for the rest of the family. The Changeling wasn't just a story about fairies. It was a story about the breaking point of the human heart. It was the black box of Victorian society, the place where they stored all the things they couldn't fix and couldn't face. When the census takers walked through those neighborhoods, they saw numbers. When the social reformers walked through, they saw the submerged tenth. But when the people living there looked at their own struggling children, they saw ghosts. And once you decide a child is a ghost, you've already started the process of letting them go. I found myself wondering if we've truly moved past this, or if we just have new myths to explain away the people we can't save. But in 1860s London, the myth was the only shield available. It was a way to navigate a world where a child was often a luxury that the working poor literally could not afford to keep alive. The stolen child wasn't in a fairy mound. He was a victim of a system that valued coal and iron more than the breath of a chimney sweep's son. But the question that haunted me as I closed that parish register was this: did the mothers ever truly believe it? Or was the story of the Changeling a silent pact they made with themselves, a necessary lie to survive the morning? I think about Martha and her letter. I think about the way she described the heaviness of the boy. That wasn't just physical weight. It was the weight of a choice she was about to make. A choice that would be buried in a margin, under a name that didn't belong to a human, but to a shadow. The transition from the ancient green hills of the English countryside to the suffocating, soot-stained alleys of Victorian London didn't just move people, it moved their demons. In the mid-1800s, London was a city of ghosts even before people died. You had thousands of families pouring into places like Bethnal Green or Spitalfields, living 10 to a room, breathing air that was more coal dust than oxygen. They brought with them the folklore of their ancestors, but the city had a way of twisting those stories. In the rural shadows of the 1700s, a changeling was a fairy creature left in place of a healthy human babe. In the urban nightmare of 1860, a changeling was something far more terrifying. It was the physical manifestation of a family's breaking point. I've spent months looking through the medical records of the Great Ormond Street Hospital from that era. You see these recurring descriptions of children who ceased to thrive. That was the official term. A child would be born healthy, perhaps even robust, but within months they would begin to transform. Their limbs would grow spindly, their bellies would distend, and their faces would take on a pinched, ancient look. They cried incessantly, a high, thin wail that sounded more like a whistle than a human voice. To a modern doctor, this is a clear-cut case of rickets, marasmus, or severe malnutrition. But to a mother who had worked a 14-hour shift in a match factory and returned to a room where there was no milk, no heat, and no hope, that child didn't look like a victim of economics. It looked like an interloper. There was a specific kind of otherness that poverty carved into these children. Malnutrition does strange things to the human skull. It makes the eyes look too large, too knowing. Neighbors would whisper. They'd stand in the damp doorways of the tenements and talk about how the child ate like a wolf but never grew. That's a classic hallmark of the changeling myth. The fairy substitute is famously gluttonous but remains a skeleton. By framing the child's hunger, not as a desperate cry for calories but as a supernatural, insatiable appetite, the community provided the parents with an out. If the thing in the cradle isn't actually your son, you aren't a monster for failing to feed it. You're just a victim of a cruel, unseen world, I remember finding a police report from 1872 involving a woman named Eliza. She lived in a cellar near the docks. Her youngest was 18 months old, but according to the constable, the boy looked no larger than a loaf of bread and had the face of a man of 80. Eliza didn't deny the neglect. Instead, she told the court that the real boy had been taken during a fever, and the thing left behind was a heavy burden that she didn't recognize. She wasn't crazy. She was using the only vocabulary she had to describe the cognitive dissonance of her life. To admit that her child was starving because she couldn't earn enough to keep him alive was to admit total personal and social failure. To say he was a changeling was a way to survive the guilt. This wasn't just a private delusion, it was an industry. If you walk through the history of Victorian London, you eventually trip over the baby farmers. These were women who advertised in the back of newspapers, offering to adopt or care for unwanted infants for a one-time fee, usually a few pounds. It was the city's most open secret. For a struggling domestic servant who had an accidental child or a family that simply couldn't afford a fifth mouth to feed, the baby farmer was the person who took the changeling away. They knew in their heart of hearts that the child wouldn't survive the week. They knew the farm was often just a room where children were sedated until they stopped breathing. But the language they used was always one of relocation, never of death. The tool of choice for these baby farmers, and for many exhausted mothers, was something called Godfrey's Cordial, or more colloquially, mother's friend. It was a thick, sweet syrup, laced heavily with opium. It was cheap, legal, and available at every corner chemist. You'd give a few drops to a crying, hungry child, and the crying would stop. The child would drift into a stupor. Their eyes would roll back, their breathing would shallow out, and they would become vacant. In the folklore, a changeling is often described as being away. Its spirit is elsewhere, its body just a hollow shell. Opium created that exact state. It turned vibrant, demanding human infants into the very ghosts the myths warned about. I've often wondered about the silence in those rooms. A child on The Friend doesn't demand anything. They sit in the corner of a dark room, staring at nothing, while the mother works the loom or sews shirts by candlelight. The drug made the neglect possible. It made the child easier to detach from. If you spend weeks looking at a baby that never smiles, never reaches out, and never seems to recognize you, the tether of the soul begins to fray. You start to see the child as an object, a piece of furniture that is slowly rotting. When the end finally came, usually listed as diarrhea or convulsions on the death certificate, it wasn't a tragedy. It was the closing of a file. The social reformers of the time, people like Lord Shaftesbury or even Dickens, tried to shine a light into these cellars, but they often missed the psychological layer of what was happening. They saw the lack of soap and the lack of bread. They didn't see the folklore acting as a sedative for the conscience. I found a diary of a parish visitor from the 1880s who described a woman in Shoreditch who refused to bury her infant for 3 days. She sat by the window, telling the visitor that she was waiting for the proper one to be returned. She believed that if she stayed quiet enough and kept the changeling's body in the house, the fairies would realize their mistake and bring back her healthy, laughing boy. It's a heartbreaking image, a woman clinging to a myth because the reality of her loss was too much to bear. This wasn't just a London problem, though the density of the city made it more visible. You see echoes of it in the mining towns of Pennsylvania and the mill towns of New England, where English and Irish immigrants brought these same stories. The changeling was a universal shorthand for the broken child. It covered everything from autism and Down syndrome to the simple, brutal effects of poverty. It was the black box where society hid its failures. If a child was born wrong or became wrong through the cruelty of their environment, the changeling myth allowed the community to distance themselves from the suffering. The more I look into these archives, the more I realize that the Victorian secret wasn't that they were cruel, it's that they were desperate. They lived in a world where the margin between survival and starvation was thinner than a sheet of paper. They needed a way to explain why some children thrived and others withered like unwatered plants. The changeling was a bridge. It connected the ancient world of magic to the modern world of the machine. It allowed a mother to look at a dying child and see something other than her own reflection. It was a dark mercy, a way to turn the unbearable into the supernatural. But as the 19th century drew to a close, The city was running out of places for the fairies to hide. The lights were getting brighter, the doctors were getting louder, and the myths were being stripped away, leaving the families of London alone with the one thing they feared most: the truth. The shift didn't happen because people suddenly became kinder. It happened because the city became too transparent. By the late 1880s, the shadows where the fairies used to live were being flooded with gaslight and bureaucracy. I've spent the last few days looking at the early maps produced by Charles Booth, the man who decided to color-code the poverty of London. He walked every street, marking the vicious semi-criminal blocks in black and the poor in blue. When you overlay those maps with the old reports of strange children or changeling sightings, the patterns line up with a terrifying precision. The supernatural was being mapped out of existence, replaced by the cold, hard statistics of the London County Council. I remember coming across a transcript from a courtroom in East London, dated 1891. A man was on trial for the neglect of his 4-year-old son. The boy was described as wasted, unable to speak and prone to fits of screaming that kept the entire tenement awake. The father's defense wasn't a denial of the boy's condition. It was an appeal to an older law. He told the magistrate, with a straight face and a trembling voice, that the boy in the crib wasn't his son. He claimed his real boy had been taken during a bout of scarlet fever 2 years prior, and this thing left behind was a gluttonous shadow that ate everything and gave nothing back. The magistrate didn't call for a priest or a folklorist. He called for a doctor. And that's the exact moment the Victorian world finally broke its silence. The doctor used words like marasmus and congenital syphilis. He spoke about the lack of sunlight, the presence of lead in the paint, and the catastrophic effects of quieting syrups, the opium-laced tonics that mothers used to keep hungry babies from crying. The court didn't see a changeling. It saw a victim of the Industrial Revolution. The father was sentenced to hard labor, and the myth was officially stripped of its legal power. But as I sat in the archive reading that transcript, I couldn't help but wonder if the father actually believed his own lie. If you're a man who can't provide enough bread for your family, the idea that a monster stole your perfect child is a lot easier to live with than the reality that your own poverty is what broke him. This wasn't just a London problem. The Victorian secret crossed the Atlantic in the steerage of every steamship. In the tenements of New York's Lower East Side and the coal patches of Pennsylvania, the changeling myth morphed into something even more desperate. I found a series of letters from a social worker in Boston, written in the 1890s, describing foundling hospitals that were essentially warehouses for the unwanted. She wrote about mothers who would drop their children off, telling the nurses the child was cursed or not of this world. It was the same linguistic trick. By labeling the child as supernatural, the mother could walk away without the crushing weight of being a bad parent. She wasn't abandoning her baby. She was returning a fairy to the woods. It's a form of psychological armor. We like to think of the Victorians as repressed and stiff, but they were masters of the useful fiction. They created a whole vocabulary of monsters to explain away the parts of human nature they weren't ready to face. The changeling was perhaps the most useful of them all. It allowed for a moral form of infanticide. If a child died because you stopped feeding it, that was murder. But if a changeling withered away because it didn't belong in our world, that was just the natural order of things. It was a loophole in the human conscience. The real tragedy of the changeling file isn't the folklore, it's the silence of the children. In all these thousands of pages of reports, diaries, and court cases, we never hear from the monsters themselves. We only hear the stories told by the people who were supposed to protect them. We see the descriptions of the unsettling eyes, the unnatural hunger, and the strange silence. But when you look through the lens of modern medicine, you realize those children weren't strange. They were just sick. They were autistic. They had cerebral palsy. They were suffering from extreme vitamin deficiencies, or they were simply traumatized by the violence of a city that had no room for the weak. I think about that every time I see a modern headline about a child lost in the system. We've traded the fairies for paperwork, and the changeling for statistical anomalies, but the impulse remains the same. We still look for ways to distance ourselves from the children who remind us of our failures. We still want to believe that the broken ones are somehow fundamentally different from us, that they belong to another world, another class, or another kind. It makes it easier to sleep at night. I closed the file on the London changelings late last night, but the feeling of it stayed with me. There's a specific kind of cold that comes from realizing that the most horrific monsters in history weren't hiding under the bed. They were the stories we told ourselves so we could look our children in the eye while we let them slip away. The Victorians didn't believe in fairies because they were whimsical. They believed in them because they were terrified of their own capacity for indifference. The secret wasn't that the babies were being replaced by spirits. The secret was that the parents were replacing their empathy with a ghost story. And once you see that pattern, you start to see it everywhere. You see it in the way we talk about the deserving and undeserving poor today. You see it in the way we pathologize behavior that we don't want to fund or support. We're still looking for the changeling. We're still hoping that the problems we can't solve are actually just shadows that don't belong to us. As I put the ledger back on the shelf, I noticed a small hand-drawn sketch tucked into the back cover. It was a drawing of a small, thin child sitting in a wooden crate, dated 1884. Underneath, someone had scrawled a single sentence in faded ink. He does not know his name, but he knows the hunger. That child wasn't a fairy. He wasn't a thief from the underworld. He was just a boy in a city that had run out of bread and mercy. The myth was the only thing he had left to clothe him. We don't tell these stories anymore, at least not in the same way. We've traded the woods for the clinic and the iron for the prescription, but the archive never truly closes. It just changes its filing system. The next time you hear a story that sounds too strange to be true, or a justification that sounds a little too convenient, ask yourself what's being hidden behind the monster. Usually, it's just a human being that we've decided is too expensive to keep. That's the end.